Welcome to the State of Politics. As usual, I'm your host, Declan McConville, and I'm joined by my co-host, Patrick McGill. Patrick, how are you doing?
I'm phenomenal, Declan. How are you?
I'm very well, and today we've got a very special guest. We have got the former Deputy Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament, a class of 99er. I'm sure the Parliament is going to miss her, but we've got the lovely Linda Fabiani joining us. Linda, how are you doing?
I'm absolutely fine. Thank you very much.
Glad to hear it. We're talking to you just now. It's still election season as we talk to you. Have you been out? We saw a wee post on Twitter. I think you'd taken a wee tumble when you were out. The joys of campaigning. How have you been getting on?
Well, you're absolutely right. I did take a tumble. First day out leafleting, down I went, ton of bricks, did my ankle in and skint my nose.
Oh dear.
So it's a good excuse for not leafleting, of course, and a good excuse for avoiding stairs. So
Yep,
yeah, I'm fine.
Definitely. So just to kick us off, could you give us a wee bit how you get into politics and how you joined the SNP?
Oh my, that goes back a long way. I believed in independence for a long time before I actually joined the SNP, but I had that sort of West of Scotland suspicion of the SNP, I think, for a long time, and wasn't convinced that it was the way forward. But then I, by chance, became friends with people who were in the SNP. Amongst them, Rosanna Cunningham and Nicola Sturgeon, in fact. And I was watching what was happening. That was the point where Alex Salmond was just on the cusp of taking the party over. And I started going to events and conferences. And at that time, you could just turn up. Nobody checked whether you were a member or not. It's very different now. And then I joined because I came to believe in not just independence, of course, which was all there for a long, long time, but also I liked the political way that the SNP was going. So I joined the party at that point, and the rest all just sort of happened. Ended up elected in 1999, which was wonderful. Yeah, been there since. Until midnight tonight. Midnight tonight, I ceased being a member.
You spoke about there joining a few years ago when Alex Salmond was first coming to the fore. What has it been like watching the party sort of not go and go and go? They were sort of in the wilderness for a few years, the sort of third place party, and then suddenly a sort of dramatic climb to the party of government, and it's been pretty phenomenal seeing them stay there for the 14 years. What has it been like seeing the party go from a sort of a party in the shadows to being the dominant party in Scotland and one of the most dominant in Britain?
It's just quite astounding, really. You know, when you think about how it's happened. You know, thinking back, to 99 when we became the main opposition. Of course, there was 35 of us, and I think that was a mark of not just the system that had been put in place for the election of the Scottish Parliament, so that everyone could be represented. But it was, I think there was also a sort of thing where people thought, oh, you know, the SNP will be good looking after Scotland, so they need a shot at that. You know, they obviously care about Scotland. And then as time went on, people began to see the competence of those that were in the party. 2007, of course, we took minority government, which was just amazing and a fabulous feeling after 8 years in opposition, proving our worth. And then I think that's where the competence came in and the vision. People liked the vision, they liked the competence. Following elections, we stood on our record, which was sound. And then, of course, the big sort of membership surge came post-referendum, I think, where people realised that they'd been had, in a way, when they looked at the vow and then what happened afterwards. And that was when the membership really grew. And that was amazing to watch because it was so unexpected. Wonderful to see happen. And of course, the party's very much changed from, as you said, one in the shadows where we were fairly small and everyone knew everyone else. And now it's, you know, the main party in Scotland and a major party in the UK. And it's a very different beast. And it has its huge advantages. Of course it does. But, you know, you could also say there's wee issues about it's quite difficult for those of us who've been there for decades to not know everybody. I think that's part of the problem. Used to be you went along to a conference or something and you met all your pals and you knew everybody. And now you go along and there's lots of what seem like strangers because it's so big. And gone are the days where a non-member like me could just wander into the conference and listen to what was going on. Now it's full security and everything else. So it's good. The advantages far outweigh the disadvantages.
Linda, you mentioned at first you became friendly with Nicola Sturgeon and Rosanna Cunningham, two members of government. So really, Rosanna stepping down like you from the Parliament, and we're going to see probably a lot of fresh figures elected to the Parliament. Do you think it's going to be good for the party to have that kind of fresh injection? We've had Christine Graham, who along with yourself was the other deputy presiding officer, who was talking about she felt the need to stay on for a bit of experience in the Parliament. Do you think there's going to be that right balance after the election of experience and new faces coming into the SNP?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing all in all. I'm very, very relaxed about it. I mean, I can see why people would say, oh, you need experience, of course you do. But I don't think any of us should ever be thinking that we're indispensable, Politics is a profession where one day you're really, really well known, and it's not too long before you're not forgotten by those who matter, but you're not in the forefront anymore. And other people come in, and hugely competent people, and take their place and move things forward. And you've always got to be moving things forward. When I look back 5 years ago, we had quite a large intake of new people then, and there were some concerns, but they've all turned out to be absolutely super participants in the Parliament. You just need to look at the likes of Kate Forbes and Mary Goujon just as examples to say, my goodness, thank goodness we had them come along. It's great. And it'll be the same this time.
We've spoken about your friendship with Rosanna Cunningham and Nicola Sturgeon. Yeah. Has it been not difficult, but you've obviously seen Nicola Sturgeon go from a friend in the party, quite a small party, to elected to the Parliament, elected to government, and now she's the First Minister, arguably the most impressive politician in the whole country. And
or in the UK.
Yeah, and she's just been through quite the year, not taking a day off, scrutinised by a committee and an independent inquiry. Could you see that coming? Obviously you couldn't see it coming. It's quite the achievement, but was there always something there with Nicola? Do you think it was inevitable, or has she really sort of worked her socks off to get where she is?
I think there's a bit of both. Nicola's the next generation from me. Rosanna and I are one generation, Nicola was the next. And of course, when I first got to know them, it was Rosanna that very much became the friend and contemporary. And she was a bit of a mentor to Nicola at the time, because Nicola was just out of university when I first met her. And it's interesting, she was always like one of the most focused people I've ever known. Smart, always smart, but focused, to the point where it was sometimes really annoying, I have to say, because there would be, we would be organising some kind of social thing and doing this, doing that. And Nicola at the last minute would say, no, I can't do it after all because I've got this political thing to do. And it was really, really annoying. But it was part of that focus. It's actually part of what makes her wonderful. And then when we got elected to Parliament all at the same time, along with many other pals, Nicola was only 27. I was in my early 40s. She was 27. And to just watch her was fascinating. And she's never, ever lost that focus. So there was a degree of inevitability about the fact that Nicola was always going to rise to the top. Certainly in our party, in our group, though at that time, never hoped that she would end up in the position she's in as First Minister. So there was a degree of inevitability because the competence and the focus and the commitment and the care has always been there, and she's gone from strength to strength. But I think Nicola would be the very first to admit that you sometimes need a bit of happenstance in there as well, the way that things work out and they come along. But what she's got is that ability to take full advantage of all that and the bigger picture sight that she has of what's required for the country. So a degree of inevitability, yes, and certainly always the competence and the vision and commitment to do it. So No, I'm not that surprised at where she is now.
Linda, how big an asset do you think she's been to the SNP? Obviously, she served under Alex Salmond under him for 7 years until 2014 before taking over from the reins. We've saw her ratings go up. She's the most popular politician in the country. In terms of independence and, in an election, how big an asset do you think Nicola Sturgeon's been, and how much do you think the past year has helped boost that? Because, whether you like her or not, she's been there every single day. She's turned up for briefings multiple times with Jason Leach by her side and Gregor Smith and put herself up in front of the Scottish people, as well as obviously the committee, which will come on to do so, and sat there for such a long time as First Minister. How big an asset do you think she is, not even just to the party, but to the people of Scotland?
It's a massive asset, and you just up there. It's a massive asset to the party, of course she is. I would say the greatest asset that we've ever had, because she's a woman of her time. She has come into her own at exactly the right time. Massive asset. She's also a great asset for the country because she's inspired a confidence that we can move forward. And she's a great asset to the cause of independence. I mean, her absolute commitment and belief in independence is what drives her, because she knows we can do things better. She has an absolute desire to make things better for people. So, an asset to the country, certainly. I would say she's even beyond that. I think she's grown to the extent where she's just a general asset, if you like, because you get people from even out with Scotland who are looking at her and influenced by her in what is achievable and the way politics should be, because no one could ever doubt her commitment either to her cause and her country. So, huge.
Spoke briefly about the committee there, Linda. You were obviously in the room for the 6 hours, I think it was, with Alex Salmond, and the 8 hours with Nicola Sturgeon, and of course the sort of 15-minute question from Margaret Mitchell. Firstly, did you ever think that Margaret would stop speaking when she was asking the question? And secondly,
I'll always be grateful to Margaret, because she gave me a bit of fame at the end of my career that I never had before. Because all of a sudden I became a GIF on Twitter.
Yep. I think everybody watching, Linda, felt like you in that room that day when we saw that question.
There's just one thing I haven't learned in the 21 years that I've been elected is to hide my emotions on my face, and if ever anything shows up, it's that. Mark was so intent on asking particular things that she just, I think, just rolled them all into the one question, which just became unintelligible almost, because I had no idea what she was talking about half the time. And my worry was that our witness, regardless of who that witness had been,
yes.
I'm happy, Nicola, that our witness would just not be able to answer because she wouldn't really know what the question was. So, yeah. And it's these things, like when you're live like that, you don't get the chance to redo it. Margaret's probably seen that since and thought, man, if only I could have stopped and said cut and go back to the beginning and maybe ask 6 questions shorter.
See, on that committee, Linda, we won't go into it too much because what's happened, the reports came out on it, but in terms of your role on that, I think it'd be quite good for our listeners to understand, convening a committee must be difficult at any point, but when you've got legal boundaries that you need to abide by, how hard is that? Because obviously you're the person in that room that needs to watch that you're not, going over the score with what's already in place in terms of the evidence. You had what became a very partisan committee of big personalities in the Parliament, Murdo Fraser and whatnot, Alec Cole-Hamilton, Jackie Bailey, battling it out, and as well as that, 2 large Scottish figureheads in Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond. How difficult was it to, not just cope with that, but cope with the legal aspects of that particular committee?
All of that combined to make it really difficult. There were the legal constraints, huge legal constraints, and nobody should ever forget that at the heart of this, and what we were looking into was the government's actions. We weren't looking into Mr. Salmond's court case or anything. We were looking at government actions in terms of all different aspects of it. And at the heart of it were two civil servants who had raised complaints about a former First Minister. They had, along with other women who had come forward with complaints and were part of a court case, there were legal obligations put on everybody about the limits to what could be said in public, all about potential identification of these women. So and I have to say, the whole of the committee were made very, very aware of this. What muddied the waters somewhat was the raw politics that committee became. And that was really difficult to deal with, because you had not just what was happening in the committee, you had what was out with the committee. You had it in the chamber of the Scottish Parliament, which I thought was completely out of order while there was a committee ongoing for other party leaders and indeed members of the committee to be using First Minister's question time, using debates to try and have a go at the First Minister of Scotland. I thought that was bad practice. It went on. There were also leaks. Yep. And I don't know where the leaks came from, but there were leaks, some of which were very, very difficult. There was a lot of politicking going on. So whilst every member knew the limitations, you would get those who would push it right to the limit. I think because they knew I would stop them. You know, there's a bit of a game going on. I'll say this, but she'll not let it be answered. She'll stop me. And then the SNP will look bad because they're trying to cut things down. So there was all of that going on. Yep. And on the other side, you had social media, which is not to you two, but to my generation, is a completely new phenomenon, So you had social media who, all these experts, I'm fascinated by the number of people in Scotland who are legal experts, way beyond the expertise of the courts and the Lord Advocate. So you had all these people in social media giving their opinions, some of which were pretty vile, I have to say, as to what should happen, what could happen, and how things had been run. So there was an awful lot of pressure on. And for me, there was two things that shouldn't be forgotten. The people at the heart of it, and, I was obviously trying to protect them, as you should, both morally and legally. But there was also the Parliament staff. I mean, the Parliament staff, the clerking team and everything, they're not political. They're not allowed to be political. And all of a sudden, they were in this complete morass of nasty politicking. And that was really difficult for them too. So I felt a responsibility to them as well, as convener of the committee, leader of the team, if you like, to protect them as well. So yes, it was difficult, but it's all part of the job. I signed up for it. That's what I did. So we got through it. And one of the things I find quite sad is the report that we produced was very detailed and actually an excellent report. And but that's all forgotten, because all that seemed to matter at the end of the day was, did they get Nicola Sturgeon, I find that really sad. I don't intend to give up on that, actually. I mean, I know I won't be an MSP, but I want to know what happens to that report. I want to know that the things within it have been acted upon, because I think it's absolutely crucial that when you look at the civil service, it's a UK civil service. So across the UK, if the civil service is dealing with issues the way this was dealt with, I think that's problematic, and I certainly won't be leaving it lying.
Well, let's hope there is a sort of inquiry into not only how it was handled, but how it was leaked. The private session that I think was leaked. The committee was obviously set up to establish how the two women were failed. Obviously, that wouldn't have happened if there wasn't a court case, if certain actions hadn't been taken. Obviously, this all sort of came to light in August 2018. There wasn't a lot of talk about it until the trial, because we didn't know what the allegations were, what the details were. Then it was heard in court, and then immediately after the court, there was the coronavirus, the inquiry, and now we've got an election. So there's not really been a lot of time, despite there being 3.5 years or 2.5 years, to actually digest what has happened. Is it quite a traumatic thing for someone who's been in the party so long, or quite a surprising thing to see someone like Alex Salmond being accused of those accusations, for being found not guilty, but admitting to some inappropriate behaviour, and then sort of trying to get back into Parliament, sort of, you could say, gaming the system and try to take votes off the SNP. Has it been quite hard to digest as someone who's been in the party for so long and known him personally?
It's hard to digest. I'm not that surprised. Well, wait a minute, let me qualify that. I'm not that surprised where we're at now, right? The big surprise was at the beginning when the accusations and things came out. And that was just gutting. Absolutely gutting for those that have been around for a long time. And as you say, had worked with Mr. Salmond. It's shocking. I don't know if people will ever get over it. What's happened since? It's also happened in stages. You know, you were saying over that 3-year period, all the different elements of it. So where we're at now is not a huge surprise to me, having followed it through the 3 years. I wish we weren't where we're at. I think it's really sad that Alba has suddenly popped up. I have no problem with other parties believing in independence. Of course I don't. I'm just not convinced that the motivations
are the right ones.
In the Alba party are the right ones. And that bothers me. You know, on one hand, they say it's all about independence. And on the other hand, you back to social media and back to even some of the main players. They have other agenda, and you actually see a lot of hatred towards Nicola Sturgeon, a lot of hatred towards the SNP. So I'm not convinced that it seriously is what they say it is. And there's a particular issue of it really, really bothers me. All this talk about a supermajority, where that's come from, you know, you're like, where did this come from? It's always been a simple majority that we've talked about. And what really bothers me is if you're putting out there that it's about a supermajority and we only achieve, you know, like a majority of 6 or 7, you're leaving an open door for the likes of Boris Johnson and his cohorts and some of the hostile press and everyone else to come in and say, well, it's not valid because you don't have a supermajority. And I think that's dangerous stuff because it's way back to what we had at the 79 referendum for the Scottish Parliament, where the system was all dealt with so that it couldn't happen. And I think it's quite unforgivable the way they've thrown that into the public domain and tried to make it expectations. So, problematic.
Yeah,
and gutting. Yes, it's gutting.
It's been a new phrase, and even, you know, arguably in the last Parliament, you know, there was you could call it an independent supermajority. There was a majority of Green and SNP MSPs to the Parliament. So, you know, the need for Alba really at that point, and what the polls say just now, there wasn't. And, you know, as you say, Linda, the actual motivation to come back and some of the figures that we've seen join the party is very, very strange. And, you know, we speak here before the election. I don't see them making any gains. And Christine, when she was on the podcast, had said the only people they're going to take votes from is the SNP. So in what way is that benefiting the independence cause as the main vehicle? But
yeah. And see, can I the supermajority thing?
Yeah.
You know, in the last Scotland Act, it was agreed that the term supermajority would be used about constitutional changes for the Parliament as a whole to vote with. So there had to be a supermajority of members of the Parliament for constitutional change. And the supermajority is defined as 2/3. So they're throwing this word out there. So, you know, what underlies that is 2/3. Oh, you didn't get 2/3, so that's rubbish. 2/3 is defined in the Scotland Act. So you didn't achieve it and it's constitutional, you know? And I think that's hugely, hugely difficult and disingenuous. And, you know, I just can't believe that people of the stature of those who are heading up the Alba party weren't aware of that.
Yeah, they're sort of changing the boundary for a referendum from 65 votes, which is a simple majority, to I think 86, if my maths is correct. I think it is, and it's almost as if they're trying to hamper the cause. I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they are trying to hamper the cause.
Cause are hampering Nicola Sturgeon, which?
Yes, I mean, there was a very disappointing comment in, I think it was a New Yorker magazine, asked why Alex Salmond was trying to take down Nicola Sturgeon, he said, I could have taken her down if I tried, or something along those lines. And the motives seem very, very odd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Moving on, back to kind of the committee as an actual convener, Linda. You've been in the Parliament since it started. One of the questions we ask a lot of our guests on here is about the House of Lords, is about how the Parliament and, you know, the Scottish Parliament in comparison holds the government to account. Do you think that committees, even in that terms, although it did become a bit messy politically wise, we did see partisanship, how important do you think committees are to the Scottish Parliament? Do you think they're effective enough? And one of the other questions we've asked a lot of people is, would you like to see more members actually elected so there's a greater span of members? Because some of the other parties obviously have the same people sitting in different committees, and, you know, workload wise it's very hard to do. So do you think that committees in the Scottish Parliament could be improved in any way, or do you think at this current point in time that they're in good shape to hold the government to account?
I think they could be more effective. The jury's out for me on absolutely how that could be achieved, but there's a few points that I think are problematic that were thrown up by that final committee that I chaired. And one of them is the power of the convener. That sounds terrible, that I wanted loads of power, but I don't mean it that way. It's the power of the convener, the power of the committee, and indeed the sanctions that Parliament put in place. I mean, as it is at the moment, members of the Scottish Parliament are all bound by the Code of Conduct for MSPs. I think it's a bit out of date. Committee conveners don't have power over anything that happens out with the committee. So even if I felt that a member of my committee was totally out of order in some of the things they did out with the committee, but relevant to the committee, there was absolutely nothing I could do about that. And the Code of Conduct itself wasn't such that was able to deal with it. And I would go back to social media again. I know I sound like an old crony when I'm talking about this, but I think there is an issue that we haven't caught up with, is that, you know, when people sit in a committee and tweet stuff, when people take their break from the committee and go and tweet stuff so that the press then pick it up and they can deal with it afterwards, that's problematic, and there's nothing in the Code of Conduct to stop that. And if the party groups themselves are not going to police that, and if the party groups themselves are going to get really political about committees, we have to put something in place that doesn't allow that to happen, because it stymies the good work of the committee. You know, you get that, you'll get private sessions where people are frightened to say things in case it gets taken outside. And if you can't prove who did it, there's no sanction, you know. So there has to be a way of looking at it to beef them up. As far as holding the government to account, that could probably get a bit stronger. I think there are issues as to whether we should have elected conveners or committee members elected. But every system you put in place can be played to a certain extent. So we have to be very careful that we don't replace one thing with another without thinking through all the implications. And you're probably looking at what's the least bad as opposed to what you can do that's perfect. So I'm hoping that the next presiding officer, as presiding officers do, will look seriously at how things can be improved. And I certainly, another thing I'm not going to let go is it's my intention to write to the new presiding officer, whoever that may be, and give my views of that last committee I chaired as to where the problems lay, so that they can perhaps use that to look at potential solutions. Yeah.
What is the sort of consequence of breaking a member's code of conduct? Do you just sort of get thrown off the committee? Because you obviously can't be sacked as an MSP. So is there a punishment or?
Well, there are sanctions, and they've been applied very seldom. And having said that, they've been applied very seldom because it hasn't been justified to apply them much at all. I got loads of emails from people who were saying to me things like, you're a crap convener because you are allowing Murdo Fraser to go on social media. You're an absolutely rubbish convener. You're really weak because Jackie Bailey did this or Alec Cole-Hamilton said that. You did nothing about it. Bottom line, there was nothing I could do. I had no power to do anything. Under the Code of Conduct, somebody's got to physically, or actively rather than physically, actively complain about the actions of someone. It can be investigated by Standards Committee, or actually by the Standards Commissioner, who then gives a recommendation to the Standards Committee. Sanctions can be applied, like you can be not allowed on the parliamentary complex for a couple of weeks or something, and your pay gets docked and things like that. But it's the proving that's always difficult. And that's what, when I was talking about this social media thing, what's always been difficult under the Code of Conduct is to prove who leaked, who did this, who did that. There's nothing there that says, well, it's very obvious who that was because they put it on Twitter, and it's inappropriate. There's nothing to deal with that kind of thing. And that's what has to be looked at, I think. Thou shalt not tweet. I think that's what we need. The 11th commandment.
They should maybe put that in. Obviously, once all the evidence had been taken, once every witness had been spoken to, how does all that information then be kind of collated and put into producing that final report? Because it's so lengthy, and it's something I've always found really, really interesting. And how do you, because you need to work together to obviously produce a document like that, and as you say, for the civil servants that were working that aren't meant to be political, that must have been a really difficult job with the amount of mud that was getting slung about in the room.
Well, the Parliament staff, who, for clarity's sake, for anybody listening, are not actually civil servants. They're employed by the Parliament.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So although they behave like civil servants, in terms of being non-political and everything else, and many of them came from the civil service, excuse me, in the first place, but they are Parliament staff. They're hugely skilled. So our inquiry was split into 4 parts, though nobody would have thought it. There was the stuff about the harassment allegations in the first place and the formulation of policy and how that came about. There was the court case issue. There was the breaking the ministerial code issue, and there was the moving forward issue. So the only bit that was hugely problematic was about the breaking the ministerial code stuff. And that was back to the getting Nicola Sturgeon, if you like. So actually, the committee worked really, really well on the first part, which was investigating the formulation of policy and what could have been done better and all that. So that report was ongoing, and we agreed most of it as we went along. When it came to the judicial review, there was no argument because the government, they lost it. The government's actions were such that they screwed up. So again, there was no real dubiety about that either. It became clear fairly early on that there was no conspiracy as such as had been mooted. So that was kicked into touch. So again, that was generally agreed. The only bit that caused problems was the last session when we were putting the stuff together about what Nicola Sturgeon knew when and, how she behaved and everything else. That was the only bit we had disagreement on, actually. And that was the stuff that was leaked to the press while the committee meeting was ongoing that caused all the fuss at the end. So actually, the report itself was largely consensual in that strange sort of way, and it was only that one bit. And, the way I look at that is we'd had a couple of years of constantly going at the First Minister, looking for something to get her in the chamber, First Minister's questions. It was constant. At the end up, there was nothing, really. Yep. And, the ongoing inquiry, the James Hamilton QC inquiry into the ministerial code found quite clearly that she hadn't breached it. So there had to be something to put her back in the frame, and it turned out it was this. So.
Just sort of moving on to the election. The SNP obviously want to have another independence referendum after the recovery. They want both votes. They want a majority. Do you think it's vital for the SNP to have a majority in order to have a referendum, or do you think it's vital to have an independence majority in order to have a referendum? Because what Mike Russell said, I think it was in January, the 11 steps to independence was, we're going to have a vote. If we win in the chamber, we'll ask for a Section 30, and if we don't get a Section 30, we're going to legislate for a vote anyway, and they can challenge us in the Supreme Court. Do you think it's essential for the SNP to get a majority, or is it just essential for an independence majority in the chamber?
I actually think it's essential for the SNP to get a majority. Well, essential, maybe that's a bit strong. I think the SNP having a majority sends a clear message to Westminster that we ain't going away. And absolutely straight there. The SNP's got the backing of Scotland. And how can you deny democracy of a referendum to Scotland when they have voted for and given a majority to, against all the odds, of the party which is very clear and has in their manifesto, this is what we're going to do. So, vital. However, the Greens also believe in independence. So having a majority with the backing of the Greens, a majority for independence, is also valid. Of course it is, because you have a parliament where the majority of members want an independence referendum. I mean, it's absolutely beyond me how Labour can be saying that they don't think it's right that there should, well, they're not. It's not even that's what they're saying. They're not even saying they don't think it's right there should be a referendum. They're saying there shall not be a referendum. How dare they? I can understand the Tories because, it's just the way they are. Lib Dems, I think they've proved themselves more unionist than anybody else of late. But the Labour Party, which is supposed to be the party of the people, they kept saying, to deny democracy to the extent of saying, we're not letting you have a referendum. And you know what? We'll back that Tory bamstick down the road in stopping a referendum before we will agree with the majority of the people in Scotland. I just think it's most bizarre. So an independence majority is enough. And, I just hope beyond hope that the Labour group or some of the Labour group will just say, no, wait a minute, step too far. I can't deny democracy. Some of them have been on the verge of that as we've gone along. I would like to see more of it. And I think that would be really powerful if they would do the right thing.
Do you think an SNP majority would sort of open up the possibility of a Section 30? Because I think the last Parliament voted twice for a Section 30 order with an SNP minority, and I don't think Theresa May or Boris Johnson ever entertained it, whereas in 2012, when there was a majority for the SNP, David Cameron went, yep, fine, have one, and there was, I think, the Edinburgh Agreement. Do you think, I think it would be preferable for all parties if it didn't go to the Supreme Court. So do you think it opens up the possibility of or he does a U-turn, as he has done in the past, and actually grants us a referendum?
Yes, I would say so. One of the things that people always say, against independence, against a referendum, and all that is about what the international community think. They look at the UK, that's what they see. They're not interested in Scotland. Blah 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 blah. Turn that in its head. What will the international community think of a Westminster government, a government of nations? Not regions, nations by their own admission, who says we are denying the democratic will of the people and part of that nation, part of that political construct, which is the UK, the nation of Scotland. So, if you turn that in its head, there's an awful lot of justifying to do by the UK government to say we are denying the people of Scotland what we have been going round the world fighting for other people for generations. It's just ludicrous. So, yes, I think they may well do that. One of my worries is that they immediately, and again, I would go back to the Alba party, all this talk about immediately open negotiations, Do you know what? Never mind, I'll rest that there. But one of my worries about that is that Boris Johnson and the others go, aye, all right, you can have your referendum, there's a Section 30, but you've got to have it in 3 months. And by the way, you're not over the COVID-19 crisis yet. That's a worry as well, that we're getting forced into corners with, which I think are very unhealthy.
I think Nicola Sturgeon did the right thing in saying that a referendum, if the people of Scotland decide to choose that, will come post-COVID, post-recovery. And I think for a lot of Scottish people at this point in time, that recovery is linked to an independent Scotland, because people see a chance. We've spoken to a lot of different people on here about climate as well as a referendum. People know at this point in time the world has been changed, the country's been changed, people have lost loved ones, but we've saw the gaps in society through homelessness and stuff that, we want a better country. And a lot of people are of the view, we're all in this podcast of the view, that the only way that Scotland can properly do that is by having its own powers and being an independent country. So I think it's important to do that post-recovery. I don't think it's right to, just start right away. We're still in this terrible time of a pandemic. But you touched on there, Linda Bauer, on constitutional questions, the Lib Dems. Now, the Lib Dems have had a position that we should have had another people's vote on the EU, but now say that we shouldn't have another Scottish independence referendum. I mean, I don't know how that weighs up. On the Lib Dems and on the Labour Party even, we've spoken a lot in this podcast as well. Two parties at once where parties are governing. How do you think those two could ever come back in Scottish politics? Because the Lib Dems, I think, for their Tory coalition, are just completely distrusted by the people of Scotland. And I think for the way Labour acted in 2014, the people of Scotland don't trust them. Do you see any way back in the coming years or even in this election for the two parties?
Now, do you know what? I think one of the strange things is, why I don't understand why they haven't thought this through, is that the way back for them would be in an independent Scotland. Because when Scotland becomes independent, you've got to have free and fair elections. And, our own party, my own party, the SNP, I would imagine will become, the equivalent of a sort of European social democratic parties, where we sit on our social policy and things. We'll fight the election same as everybody else. But you may find that there are Labour voters who had a belief in independence, or who had a belief in the SNP as a competent government, will start to look back at, where their natural sympathies lay. I think the Labour Party in particular, post-independence, would become a Scottish Labour Party, not ruled by Westminster, but, would look at what's best for the country. And so to me, that's, that's a no-brainer for me, particularly for the Labour Party. The Lib Dems I'm not so sure of. I'm never quite sure of where they're at. It's difficult to tell, really.
I don't think they're sure of themselves, to be honest.
I don't think Willie and Rennie and the rest of the party know where they're at, Linda, so I don't think we'd only fortunate talking about the Lib Dems at this moment in time.
Aye.
Just on the Labour Party, I mean, I think there's a whole range of views within their party. They want to sort of avoid independence at all costs. They're coming up with, I think Keir Starmer spoke about federalism. I think one or two of their sort of their MSPs have spoken about a three-way referendum with federalism as an option.
Yeah.
Federalism for me is something that happens in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then regions within England. Mm-hmm. And we've seen in 2004, and I think possibly in Wales as well, that there isn't an appetite the same way there is in Scotland for more powers devolved. So if it's not federalism, then it's devo max to the Scottish Parliament, and we've been promised that before and it hasn't been delivered. So the two positions that I see just now for the Labour Party, they both have holes in them. So this podcast will be going out after the election.
Yep.
So can you see? Don't want to get you to make predictions or anything, but do you think it will be a majority? A sort of, maybe there's an outside chance. Are you hopeful that it will be a majority, or do you think we'll fall short?
I'm always hopeful that there's a majority, I was even hopeful in 2003 when we had the worst result in the Scottish Parliament. Yeah, I'm hopeful. Absolutely hopeful, because we've done it before. You know, but when we did it in 2011, that was astounding. You know, it was the thing that everybody said couldn't be done, but we did it because the people came out and said this is what they wanted. And that can happen again. And I think that's why, you know, you were saying my colleague Christine has said, you know, that other parties that pop up for independence, and I'll leave the Greens aside from this because, you know, they're well established, that's a whole different thing.
Yep.
Newer parties that pop up for independence, all they're doing is taking votes off the SNP. And we don't want that. We can do it. It has been done before. So stop saying it's impossible, you know, to these people that keep saying it's impossible. We can do it. And of course I'm hopeful. I mean, I look at these opinion polls and, you know, I then discount them immediately because who the heck knows? You know, Scots are, we all know that from canvassing. Scots, not so much this time, we're not been able to do it, but Scots are terrible for just no letting on, you know? Aye, maybe hen.
Don't like telling people their vote, and the only poll that is going to matter is going to be an election day, and whatever that may be. Obviously, we won't get an idea of that until the Friday because it's
the turnout. You know, you don't get great turnouts for Scottish Parliament elections, and that bothers me. We had a wonderful turnout in the referendum. Remember,
Yep.
back in 2014, it was what, 80-odd%?
I think it was 84-85%, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, how can it not be that this time? And I'm really worried that we've a lower turnout this time because of COVID. Though the postal vote numbers were quite hopeful,
Yep.
From what I understand. So, and it's going to be really strange not being up half the night for the counts.
It is going to be strange, but at least you'll get some sleep and won't be, you know, it'll be a wee bit calmer, and we never know. This might be the way to do an election, postal voting everybody, and just take it a wee bit more relaxed and staying up until the crack of dawn and whatnot. We spoke about the committee earlier on, and obviously Nicola Sturgeon came in front of that committee for 8 hours, and in recent weeks in the news, not just in recent weeks, for the past year and a bit, ever since Boris Johnson was elected Prime Minister, we've saw his government and himself, a lot of questions being asked of accountability. Most recently, James Dyson, Texas, having casual conversations with billionaires, dodgy PPE contracts with Mr Hancock, a bullying scandal that was kicked out with civil servants leaving because basically we couldn't sack Mrs Patel. How different do you think, not just, you know, politicians in Scotland are in terms of their way to the people, but how different the two countries are at this moment in time? Because, you know, Westminster just seems a million miles away from the way in which Scottish politics are even acting, and as many criticisms that everybody would probably have about that committee, and even you'd admit them yourself, it showed democracy in action, and it showed a parliament and a people that cares about their country. You know, how different do you think the two countries are politically at this point in time? And, you know, is that even more of a clear definition of why Scotland needs to be an independent country?
Big questions. And certainly, you know, the differences, and some of them can be explained by the fact that we're a small nation, and it's a bit of a goldfish bowl, so everybody can see what's going on. Explained by the fact that MSPs like me, until midnight tonight, are in our own communities and going to schools and interacting with folk all the time. The localism of it, I think, is much more. So some of it can be explained by that. But when you look at the differences, you know, our First Minister came to that committee for 8 hours of questioning. Good on her. I mean, she was knackered at the end of it. She must have been. You cannot imagine Boris Johnson putting himself up for that.
Not a chance.
You just can't. But the other thing is, it's one of these things that sometimes in Scotland I think is healthy, which is that view that everybody's the same and nobody should get special treatment. But it's got a downside. Because I don't think anybody that was giving Nicola such a hard time would actually expect Boris Johnson to come and do 8 hours. But they expected Nicola Sturgeon to come and do that. They also expected her to take all the snash under the sun and the cheek and the disrespect. because I thought the disrespect was huge. Regardless of who the First Minister is, I think the position demands a bit of respect until they do something to lose it completely. And I don't believe Nicola Sturgeon has done anything to lose it completely. Same as the way I don't think Jack McConnell ever did anything to lose complete respect. And that position should therefore be respected, and it wasn't. So I think that's a huge difference. Does it mean there's a difference between England and Scotland? I don't particularly think so, because it may be that if you had a fairly new parliament in one of the parts of England, a sort of devolved legislature or assembly, that they would behave very differently as well. Because I think the institution that is Westminster has allowed itself to become very cut off and very, very separate from the people. And as far as England's concerned, people say, oh, they're different, they keep voting Tory, they're different from us. Well, I don't think they're that different from us. What alternative have they got? Scotland has an alternative. Scotland has the alternative of saying we can do this differently and we can vote for parties that will allow us to do it differently by independence. You may even get some people that say, we'll vote for them. I don't actually believe in independence, but they'll stand up for Scotland and they'll not take any nonsense from down the road. But when you look at England as a whole, they don't really have that alternative. They've got the Tories, who are pretty horrible. They've got the Labour Party, who've been all over the place and, not offering any real alternative. The Lib Dems shot themselves in the foot with their coalitions and their broken promises. And then you've got the Farages and people like that pop up. So what else are they going to do? I think with them sometimes it's better the devil you know. And that can be difficult. I mean, I certainly think some of the votes at constituency level that we've seen for the Tories last time was seriously worrying. I think it was as much a mark of the failure of the Labour Party as chief opposition as it was of the Tories being successful. So the local elections in England this week will be interesting as well. We're not really concentrating on them for obvious reasons, but some of that will be interesting. I heard that Hartlepool this morning. Hartlepool, the Tories are ahead, and you're like, my, oh my, what's happening there?
Yep. Unbelievable.
Until England gets an independence party, I don't think there'll be much independence of a good civic nationalism, not the kind of independence that led us to Brexit, which was appalling.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty appalling, the situation that we're in. I mean, a statistic that astounded me was that I think the Tories got a higher percentage of the vote in England than the SNP did in Scotland. And all the commentators were talking about how great a result this is for the SNP. But then you look at the Tories in England and they're actually performing better. And it's definitely one of the main reasons I would support independence, because you're looking at the Scottish Parliament and you can't really see a route for the Tories into government, whether it's a coalition or a majority. You just can't see it happening. So you'd be able to pursue a different sort of social and economic policy. What would you say, going back to when you say you've always supported independence and you still support it now?
Not always, actually.
Not always?
Not always, no. I was a natural Labour supporter. I was never a party member. I was a natural Labour supporter, and then it was probably during my 20s I started to look at stuff, I went through the miners' strike and stuff like that, watching stuff going on and thinking, I'm not convinced of any of this, And Neil, what was it? Oh, gosh, my mind. Kinnock, that's the man.
Easily forgettable, don't worry.
Easily forgettable.
I thought he was great at the start, and then he did some stuff that I just didn't like. And that was when I really started to look at things and came to the conclusion that actually independence was a good thing for Scotland. As I say, it was separate from the SNP at that point. So probably in my 20s, because, up through my teens and stuff, everybody just thought the SNP were a bunch of nutcases, It was
Tapping Tories, as that old phrase was. Yep.
Yeah, it was what the sort of common parlance was. I mean, I remember, I never did it myself. I'm actually pleased to say I never did it myself. But I do remember people being laughed at, pals being laughed at and vilified because they admitted that they voted SNP, you know. Even when I started campaigning in the 80s, people were absolutely horrible at times about the SNP, you know, spitting on you and stuff. It's horrible. It's amazing how it's changed. And that's why I have such massive respect for the old timers. You know, I know I'm getting there myself, retiring, but, you know, the generations before me who were there in the really hard times. You know, the 60s and stuff, 50s and 60s, and pushing the message. My goodness, without them, we'd be nowhere.
Yeah, I think I figure like Winnie Ewan is the definition of somebody like that did so much for the party, and I don't think it's any mistake that it's somebody that Nicola Sturgeon looks up to. Just finally from me, Linda, obviously you're stepping away from Parliament. I'm sure you'll still be, as you say, you're going to write to the next presiding officer, and you'll still be keeping a keen eye on it. The next 5.
I'm not going to be one of these pain in the necks, though, you know, angry from slaving or anything like that. It's going to be one off. I don't want anybody to think that I'm going to be constantly on that.
Turning up for your lunch every Thursday and remember me. So you're going to take the back seat. In the next 5 years, what would you like to see happen? Again, this is going to be before the election, obviously. I'm sure you would like to see an SNP win. What would you like to see in the next 5 years? Independence and joining the EU again?
Oh, I mean, what I would love to think is that it would go like this. We get a majority at this election. We get a majority at the referendum. And that the next election we will have in Scotland will be an election for an independent Scotland. All our folks in Westminster will be back up the road. They don't need to be down there anymore. Election for an independent Scotland. And I would hope that most manifestos, regardless of party, would have re-entry into the European Union, and that we would have by that point a commitment from the European Union that would be fast-tracked back in. That would be my absolute ideal. And then I could really retire, you know.
Job done.
Just finally for me then, Linda, you say you're retiring. What is next for you then? Is it just a sort of an easy life, or can we expect memoirs? Will we see you at IndieRef 2 campaigning maybe in 2026 for in the first independent elections for the new independent Scottish Parliament?
Or maybe a Scottish president?
Maybe,
possibly.
Like Michael Higgins in Ireland.
Oh, what's next for me? The only definite in anything that you have said is about the campaigning for independence. That just doesn't stop. As for the rest of it, my plan was always travel. And some wee bug came along called COVID-19 and stopped that, because that really was my plan. My plan was I was going to get a flight to somewhere. I didn't know where. I was just going to jump in a plane, go somewhere, and just come home when I felt like it, and just go to lots of different places all the time. Just go to an airport and see what the first flight was and get on it. So not only is that difficult because of COVID, it obviously can't happen. So I'm going away to the north of England for my first wee break. But it's better than nothing. And the other thing that stymied that is Brexit, you know, because it wouldn't be so easy just to dot about the world, and it really annoys me. I do have the option of trying to get an Italian passport. But, you know, I don't want to have to do that because I'm Scottish. I want a Scottish passport. You know, so my plan is travel when I can from an independent Scotland.
Well, hopefully that will be something that happens in the near future. Just finally, Linda, thank you for joining us. We know this is a very busy time. Although you are stepped away, I'm sure you're still, you know, very much part of the campaign trail just now. So we wish you both wish you a very happy retirement, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for coming on, Linda.
It's been a pleasure, let me tell you, to be able to just speak with people instead of constantly being harangued in a setting such as this has been lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.